All right, welcome to our Lifeboat Academy Sociocracy 3.0 onboarding. Um, Today I'm going to go over the basics of Sociocracy 3.0, and I'm really going to focus on sociocracy as a framework, so that this could be a video that would be relevant to lots of people who might be considering sociocracy. Later on, we can talk about some of the specific ways that we implement sociocracy at the Lifeboat Academy. But I'm going to go through the presentation. Hopefully it'll be a half an hour or less, and then we'll take questions at the end. And again, then we'll post this to YouTube and make sure that other people have access to it. And we'll hopefully add to our resource library that way. So Sociocracy 3.0, I guess to start off, there are a number of different versions of sociocracy out there. They're kind of flavors of sociocracy. My preference is for Sociocracy 3.0, which is something that comes out of European context. Most of the variants of sociocracy have the same core ideas, the same core philosophy. They're just some subtle differences in some of the tools that they include and the way that they present them. And one of the things I quite like about Sociocracy 3.0 is that all of their materials are Creative Commons license, and they promote just adapting to your own use, using the materials that they provide, adapting them to your use, and sharing them on. And I quite like that spirit behind it. So who is this webinar for? It is primarily for change agents, for people who are wanting to get active and make the world a better place, and especially for people who are forming teams, who are looking for to create a real rich collaborative environment in which to work. There are lots of different ways that sociocracy can be applied. I've seen and worked with it in for-profit business contexts, but I'm really going to be going at it from the angle of social change makers and how we might be able to apply it in the work that we're doing. There are a number of key advantages, I think, to implementing sociocracy as a framework for how we work together. One is increased resilience and collective learning, and also building a stronger social support network around the work that we're doing. And ultimately, though, the goal is increased effectiveness, having more impact in the direction that you're hoping in the world. Being able to do the work that you do as well as you can, and to learn from that experience to do it better and better. We at the Lifeboat Academy come together often in the spirit of the blind ones and the elephant. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this parable, it's a South Asian parable about 5 blind men in a village who'd never seen an elephant before. And one day an elephant appears in the village, and the blind men are led to different parts of the elephant, and they instantly start to argue about the true nature of the elephant. The one who has the ear says it's big like a leaf, and the one who has the tusk says it's sharp like a spear. The one who has the tail says it's twisty like a rope, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what they don't realize is that they are all describing parts of a bigger whole. And often that seems like the most apt metaphor for the kind of work that we're doing, where we're all coming at it from a slightly different perspective, a slightly different angle. We all know important things about the experience from our perspective. And rather than arguing about which is the right one, we have the opportunity through sociocracy and other collaborative tools to figure out how we actually weave together our understandings in such a way that we all walk away a little bit wiser about the elephant as a whole. And the other thing that I think is important about this metaphor is it recognizes we're all a little bit blind. None of us has the complete vision. None of us can see the whole. And so that's just the situation that we confront. And so we need to find wise and effective ways of working with our own limitations. And one of those is humility, actually admitting our own limitations and figuring out how we can weave together our strengths in such a way that our weaknesses become irrelevant, as Tom Peters says. So what is sociocracy, and sociocracy 3.0 in particular? It is a social technology, which means that it is a social tool, a social knowledge base that is specifically about evolving agile and resilient organizations. And both of these words are important. Actually, all three of these words: evolving, agile, and resilient organizations. So we are looking for ways that we can build on our understanding and get smarter as we move forward. We want to do it in a way where we can be responsive to changing conditions. And because we are doing it in a way where we're responsive to changing conditions and making the best use of available resources, we're going to be as resilient as we can be. It is also, I think it's important to mention that it's meant to be scalable. You can use sociocracy. There's actually a variation that they call Sociocracy 341, FORONE, for one person. And so you can actually apply the principles of sociocracy in your own individual work. And you can also then use sociocracy as a way of organizing large 100-person organizations, which, and it has been used in those contexts. And it's also, sociocracy is not new. It actually has quite a long lineage. It was originally kind of, I would say the tracing the roots all the way back to Auguste Comte is a little bit of a stretch, but it's not. He, if you don't know your early social theory, he was one of the founders of sociology. And he had a vision of sociologists acting as the priests of the new culture, where we would learn the dynamics of how society actually works and use that in an effective way that we could actually build a healthy society. That never really took root. I wouldn't say that, there were Auguste Comte's version of sociocracy, and he did use the term sociocracy, but that never really sort of took life in the world. But the idea was out there, and it really came together in the 70s, where Gerard Endenberg put together the first sociocratic circle method. But he was building specifically on understandings of how to do direct democracy and the Quaker meeting traditions that were actually well-established meeting practices and organizational practices. And he took them and put them together, thinking specifically about how to create an effective organization that wasn't dependent on a particular spirituality or particular tradition. And that model of sociocratic circle organization has been employed by hundreds, maybe thousands of organizations since the 70s. Some of, I think, I'm pretty sure the last time I checked, the company that that this was first applied to, I can't remember the name at this point, but the company is still in operation and has hundreds or thousands of employees. So it's a system that's actually been tested in reality, and there are lots and lots of organizations that have been using it for quite a while. And which is not to say it's a silver bullet. I know of organizations that have tried to implement sociocracy and it hasn't gone particularly well. So like anything else, it's a tool or a weapon, but there are lots of real world examples of the system working, and there's a lot of experience to draw from. So there was this sort of early flush of the use of sociocracy, and then in the 2000s, people started to innovate on it a bit. One variation that became quite popular in the organizational world, in a small corner of the organizational world, was called holacracy. If you're familiar with that, that is basically a trademarked and a proprietary system that takes the ideas of sociocracy and puts them together in a very, I'm not a fan of holacracy. It's a very pay for service and command control version, ironically, of how to implement sociocracy. But it was intended to appeal to large corporations. It was intended to package what had been seen as a kind of lefty alternative way of organizing, and make it more appealing to business as usual organizations. So a lot of people are familiar with Holacracy because it did get a lot of promotion and there's a lot of marketing behind it. And there's since then, since Holacracy, there are a few other versions, newer versions of Sociocracy that have been put forward. One is Sociocracy for All, and that's oh, I'm blanking on his name now, Ted Rao, who put that together. And I have good things to say about Sociocracy for All. I think it's a very good platform, and they do really good work. There are things, though, that I like about Sociocracy 3.0 that I think make it more accessible. So anyhow, that's just, I don't mean to discourage anyone. Sociocracy for All has tremendous resources as well. And if you have an opportunity to get trained that way, it's good training, and it's a system that works. The Sociocracy 3.0 is a version, like I said, that's come primarily from a European context. And I think Germany, Spain, and I want to say Denmark, Holland, the sort of the originators come from those countries. And one of the things that I think makes it particularly interesting is that they've introduced elements of agile project management and lean methodology, which are techniques that come primarily from the tech world, from software developers and technology developers, who by necessity had to figure out how to deal with rapidly changing conditions. And so old-fashioned ways of doing top-down cascade planning just didn't work. And so and likewise, lean methodology is a methodology for startups. So how do you grow something from very, very minimal resources? You know, a couple people working in their parents' garage, and leverage those resources to actually build something that has some durability. And those two sort of ways of seeing have been incorporated into Sociocracy 3.0 in really useful ways, I think. And as a personal side note, I will say that I was developing my own version of Sociocracy. I didn't know Sociocracy existed, but I had been working with change organizations since 1993 and was recognizing certain patterns and needs and starting to put together the tools that I had seen that were successful into a little bit of a kit for myself. And as I was putting that kit together, I stumbled on Sociocracy, and it's like they took that original idea and had just gone, crazy with it. Like they were 10 years ahead in terms of putting together the tools in the toolkit. And so as soon as I saw it, I just said, well, I'm just going to sign up with this. They've kind of done the hard work. But the important thing for me is that they were doing exactly what I was doing, which was what works, what are the needs of organizations, what are the common problems organizations encounter, and what are the tools that are effective for moving through that and gathering them together. So when we talk about sociocracy, I would say it's not anything that has been invented so much as something that has been discovered. It's a set of tools that have been discovered because they are more consistently effective. So there are a couple of characteristics in that same spirit. It is flexible because if you're familiar with the concept of a pattern language, a pattern language is basically doing exactly that, looking at the patterns that already exist, making them clear and explicit in a way that they become usable, and having organizing principles that tell you when and when not to use those tools. So it's flexible in that it's just tools in a toolkit, but there's a set of principles and a way of understanding the patterns that endures. So the principles are really the foundation on which you build and know how to use the tools effectively. And the other thing that I mentioned already is that it's Creative Commons licensing. It is very much intentionally meant to be a co-created, co-managed set of methodology. And just to give you a sense of sort of the scope of the tools in the toolkit, this is the sort of the pattern map of the Sociocracy toolkit. And each of the little blue boxes are particular techniques, technologies that can be applied in different circumstances. And there's an explicit assumption that you don't need to do all of these things. You do and apply the tools that are useful in your context. And many of them are done in a way where you can start with one tool and then build in other tools, additional tools, as they become necessary. So the adaptation model for Sociocracy is you don't have to adopt Sociocracy. You don't have to suddenly decide that you're going to do everything via Sociocracy. You can pull in the tools as they are useful and eventually start to transition into a more sociocratic way of the organization working. I would say Lifeboat Academy has built from the ground up on sociocratic principles and using the tools. So we engage many of these tools, but we don't use all of them because we're just not there yet where we've needed to use all of them. But I would say the majority of these have already been applied to the way that we do the work at the Academy. And as I said, there are some key principles that make the whole system work. And I would say there's a master concept. And that concept is to consider all the decisions, all of the projects, all the work that we do as a series of experiments designed in such a way to help us discover and respond to a situation as adaptively as possible. And there's a couple really important reasons why that is both necessary and powerful. But before we get too far into it, we should probably talk about what an experiment is and isn't, because people have some odd ideas about what experiments are. As I've been trying to talk about this with diverse audiences, an experiment does not mean winging it. An experiment doesn't mean just doing things by the seat of your pants. It means doing what you think is going to work, what you think is going to achieve a particular end, but doing it in a way where you can tell if it works or not. And that's the key. It's actually the feedback mechanism where your assumptions get reality testing. And that gives you the opportunity to note the things that are working and keep doing them, and to discard or reevaluate the things that aren't working. And that's really the key for the experimental design, is that we stay open to challenging our assumptions. Even the things that we've proven before, we always have to be open to the idea the situation may have changed, or the situation might be slightly different. So some of those old assumptions may no longer be applied or applicable. But really, it is about still doing things carefully, doing the right thing, doing the thing that you think is going to be most effective, but doing it in a way where you can tell if it's working or not. So that means that one of the gold standard for all the work that we do and for the decision making we do is things only have to be good enough for now, safe enough to try. We don't have to get the perfect solution before we can move forward. We can get far enough that we think we have an experiment that's worth running, that is either going to work the way we hope it will, or work good enough that we can gain the information that we need to build a better experiment and a better experiment after that. So one of the things I love best about Sociocracy is it diffuses analysis paralysis. It diffuses that fear that we have to have the perfect solution before we can do anything, without going to, let's just do anything, right? It's sort of trying to hit that sweet spot of, you still need it to be safe enough to try. You still want to be careful and make sure that you're not just going about risking things that, taking unnecessary risks, but it just has to be good enough for now. So underlying all of this is also the reality is that most of our decisions aren't actually decisions. And this is one of the reasons why we need to take this experimental approach. The reality is that most of our decisions are habits. They're either unquestioned assumptions about how things are, or just habits that we've gotten into and we haven't really thought through that much. And that's really good because decision making is expensive. It's hard for our brains to make good decisions. So by going along with things as they normally, are kind of our habitual way of doing things, we don't have to put a lot of energy into it. It tends to work generally well in short-term situations or in situations where we are in predictable, stable environments. If you're an animal that has adapted to a particular environment, run with your instinct. Your instinct's going to get you through. The cons, though, are all of these habits, all of those assumptions are subject to very predictable biases and errors. Especially, there's a catalog of, it was something like 35, now it's probably like 150 known cognitive biases that we all share and that we all are guilty of. And so it's really easy for us to make mistakes thinking that we're doing the right thing. And it's incredibly ineffective in changing contexts. And of course, that's where we find ourselves today. Everything is up for grabs. Nothing is as predictable as we once thought it was, whether it was then or not. And so anyhow, this is really what we're fighting against in doing the experimental method, is this kind of return to habitual decision making, which has its place. There's nothing wrong with habitual decision making in the right context, but that's not the context we find ourselves in most organizations and nowadays. So this is, one of the things to keep in mind. If you always do what you've always done, you'll keep getting what you got. And if you're really happy with what you got, do that. If you're not happy with what you got, you need to do something different. So we kind of have the context now of sociocracy, why we might want to do it, and sort of what we're talking about in terms of approaching the world as a series of experiments. And there are two sets of principles in sociocracy. That makes it a little confusing. I refer to the 7 grounding principles and the 10 organizing principles. And you'll get a sense of how these differ in a minute. The core of it, for my money, if you do nothing else but learn how to adopt these 7 principles into all of the work you do, you're good. And as an aside, I will say one of the exercises that I use consistently with my groups is a peak experience exercise, where my question is, think about a time when collaboration worked really well, when everyone was kind of working together as a really effective team. What were the preconditions or the underlying things that supported those peak experiences? And I can tell you, almost every time we reinvent these 7 principles. They'll get a different name, they'll get a different description, but the principles keep coming up again and again and again. And so I'm just going to walk through each of these because they really are the heart and the soul of being sociocratic. First and foremost is equivalence, which is the idea that we involve anybody affected by a decision in shaping that decision. And it's a fundamentally practical thing. If you don't involve people who are affected by a decision or who have some ongoing responsibilities affected by that decision, you're going to miss things. This is just going slow to go fast, and making sure that you're including people who have information, who have perspectives in that decision-making process. Now, the part of the interesting discussion is, what level of effect do different people have in making that decision and shaping that decision? But the core concept is you just need to involve people who are affected by a decision in the decision making. Similarly, along the same lines, is we seek consent, and consent is different than consensus. Where consensus is we all basically have to more or less agree on it. Consent says no one objects, that there's no objection to the decision. And we'll get into a little bit some of the finer grains of how that works. But an objection is it's not good enough for now. It's not safe enough to try. There is something in this decision that is going to cause trouble. And so by being consent oriented, we say in advance, we are seeking out potential objections. We're not just going to address them if they come up. We're actually going to look for them ahead of time, because we know if we don't, again, it's going slow to go fast. If we don't raise those objections early on, when we can address them more easily, we're going to encounter them later on, and it's going to be a lot more expensive to deal with them. And then effectiveness comes from that. And because the decisions aren't just about the optimal conditions, they're about where do we put our limited time and energy in making things better. So the effectiveness principle is we only put our time and we focus our time on the things that are actually going to move us closer to our goals. And I usually shorthand this as what's the 20 that gets us 80, and how do we avoid the things that take 80 units of energy and only provide 20 units of return. And we want to focus on those areas where 20 units of energy gets 80 units of return. And we all intuitively know this. I haven't worked with a group yet where I presented this idea and everyone, when I present this idea, everyone just nods. We know there are these times we spin our wheels, and there are times when a little bit gets us a long way. So if we continue to look for the effectiveness, we're going to continue to maximize our productivity. To make all of this work, some of the lubricant that keeps this whole system moving is accountability, first and foremost. So if the principle of consent is we don't force any decision on anyone, we invite people into a decision. Accountability then says you do what you say you're going to do. You maintain we freely choose the agreements. Once we freely choose those agreements, we do everything we need to follow those agreements. And we recognize that sometimes can't happen, situations change or we overpromise or whatever. So accountability is also the idea that if you can't follow through on an agreement, you have a responsibility of fixing it, of doing what you can to kind of bring things back up to speed. And to make all of that work, you also need transparency. You need people to have access to the information that's necessary for them to make good choices about things. And I will say, just in practical experience, transparency is not the same as making everything available. It's also about making information available in a way that it's useful. So it's thinking about who needs to know what and how do you make it available in a timely way so that people can get the information when they need it. And then continuous improvement is this idea that we do the best we can until we know better, and then we do better. And that means we're always looking for ways that we can get a little bit better about implementing this. And we're treating things iteratively. So we know we're not going to get it perfect the first time. So that's why it's good to have quick cycles of design and improvement. And likewise, empiricism is, and this is for some people, it can be a bit of a trigger. Empiricism is not scientists in a white lab coat. It's basically, we want to test our assumptions through real world testing. We want to, for me, the short form of this is, what does that look like? What would that look like in the room if it were happening? Let's not talk about concepts. Let's talk about what it would feel like, look like, taste like if we were to see it in a room. So the 7 grounding principles are really at the heart of sociocracy. And like I said, the tools, if you're applying these principles, the tools will take care of themselves. You don't really have to worry about that too much. Then there are the 10 organizing principles. And these are more practically, how do we move forward on things? And I quite like this diagram. It gives you this, there's the kind of the bullseye of at the center, which is where we focus, how we keep our focus. And then there's the outer ring, which is really the container, the cultural container that allows us to keep it all together. And we'll go through each of these quickly. So like I said, in the middle are the two principles for orientation. What is our purpose? Why are we here? Why are we doing this together? And our strategy. Given where we want to go, how are we going to get there? Having those conversations so that everyone, and it's weaving together the purpose. It's not about giving people a purpose, but it's giving people the opportunity to say, why do we want to collaborate? And then the strategy is just big picture, broad strokes. How are we going to get there? Then there are 3 principles for navigation. So that's, now that we've got our sense of, in the general where we're going, how in the day-to-day do we move in that right direction? So the first, as we already talked about, it's effectiveness, which is focus on what's the 20 that gets you 80. We've already talked about this too. We do that by running experiments where we're testing our assumptions. And then sense and respond is really a way of putting in practice the principle of empiricism. So given what we've done, continuous improvement. So given what we've done, where are we now? How can we move forward? The next ring out is a balancing act. And what we're trying to balance in any organization is, how do we unleash the creativity, the passion, the innovation of individuals trying things out, but put enough of conditions on there so that we aren't constantly bumping into each other. And this is really, I like that this is the ring that has the two sides, because we are always trying to balance providing space and room for play, for creativity, but also enough control on there that we're not constantly just stepping on each other's toes. And then the container that holds this all together is the cultural aspect. So how do we make sure that we are growing into this way of working? And so one is that we build and maintain and grow shared mental models. What's that word mean to you? What does resilience mean to you? What does regeneration mean to you now? And we do it in a way where we're constantly building that shared understanding. We intentionally develop the culture, which means basically that we recognize the need for intentionality. This isn't going to be, some of this will feel alien, and some of it will feel awkward for a while, and that's okay, because we're willing to sit with that intentional awkwardness so that we can build something that works. And we're constantly investing in learning. We're figuring out what the growth edge is and how we can get a little smarter about how we do things. So when you put this all into motion, I usually short this as aim, act, reflect, but it's an iterative process where the first thing that we're doing is we're identifying the tensions, the gap between how the world is and how we want the world to be. We are taking some time to really understand, why is that the case? Oftentimes we talk about the serenity prayer of having the wisdom to accept the things that we can't change and the courage to change the things that we can, and knowing the difference. So exploring the drivers is taking that time to try to assess, what can we change, what can't we change? Then we develop proposals. We develop some concrete ideas of how could we move forward on that. And then we go through that process of making sure that we have consent, of unearthing objections and concerns, and we make an agreement. So we know this is the level of who's going to do what, when. We get as clear on that as we can. We know what each person's responsibilities are. And then we turn those into action experiments. So we actually go out and we do what we say we're going to do. And after that, we are going to take the time to reflect back on how that went, what worked, what didn't, what new tensions come up as a result of it, now that we've tried that experiment, and then we just keep engaging in that cycle. So we'll walk through each of those steps really quickly, but first we identify the tensions. A couple things that are important in this. First of all, we are centering tensions as a productive, positive thing. We're not thinking that a tension is a problem. We're not saying we're trying to get rid of tensions or avoid tensions. We're actually saying a tension is there because it's trying to get our attention. So I often say it's like the indicator light on the dashboard. The flashing light is there to get your attention, to let you know you need to look someplace else. And so it's the pointing finger. And usually it is something that has an emotional energy to it. We feel frustrated, we feel angry, we feel disappointed. There's an emotional characteristic to the tension, and that's useful. So we also need to, bring our subjective feelings into it and to respect that. And that ultimately all it is it's indicating a gap between how things could be and how they are. And in a culture where we kind of make things either or, one's good, one's bad, we either have to give up our expectations and just accept things the way they are or whatever. This is saying we hold them both equally. We treat them both as information. Once we've identified the tension, we go under the surface and we're looking for what are the real motivations, the forces, the power dynamics that are making this situation happen. And one of the most important things I think to recognize here is drivers always come in pairs or sets. It's never either or. It's never like there's one good driver and one bad driver. There are just usually balanced drivers. And the thing that makes life worth living is figuring out how do you balance those competing drivers. Once we've identified the drivers, then we start to develop proposals. And I'm not going to go through each of these points, but there is a process then of brainstorming, prioritizing, fact-checking, identifying concerns, and getting it to the level where it's concrete enough that we have some clear sense of this is what it would look like if we were to put this into motion. Once we do that, we actually come up with a proposal. We have, with the Lifeboat Academy, we have a formal document that makes it easier to make sure that you're covering the key elements of the proposal. Why are we doing it? Who's responsible for it? What would we expect to see if this works? And it's just a way of kind of holding ourselves to some discipline in setting up the experiment, really. So once we develop the proposals, then it's about making the agreements, moving from a vague idea to a consent agreement that we can all get behind. And that's where seeking out the objections is the key. So we partly in the developing the proposals by gathering considerations, which is one of the processes for setting up your proposals. By gathering the considerations, hopefully we're minimizing the objections that we're going to discover. But then we still want to take the time to say, are there some unintended consequences that might happen if we move forward on this? Is there something that says this is not safe enough to try? When you are registering objections, there is an understanding that well, I guess it's also important to note language. So you can register concerns or objections. And a concern is something that basically it may be a preference. I would prefer if we could do it this way, or I'm worried that this might happen, but I don't have any reason to suspect it. It's definitely going to happen that way. It basically is a way of getting on the record, this may not be as good as we think it is. And those get registered because as we move forward, it's not just to like kind of sweep them under the rug, but actually to list them. So as we're moving forward, we're sensitive to, oh, is that concern happening? And that gives us some really good responsiveness as we're starting to implement things. We kind of forewarned is forearmed. And then there are objections, and an objection needs to be addressed before anything can move forward. No one can override an objection. The only sort of caveat to that is the objections have to be organizational objections. It has to be something that's relevant to the mission and the project that we're all working on, which is just a way of making sure that somebody can't just sort of cross their arms and say, I object, and try to keep things from moving forward. And there's also an assumption that if you are registering an objection on a proposal, that it is incumbent on you, if you can, to offer a friendly amendment that would address your objection and keep the original intention and value of the proposal moving forward. So again, it's very collaborative, and it invites the people with the objections into the solution to those objections. And once you have consent, you document things. This is also partly where transparency becomes important. We need to write down as best we can, without getting too OCD about it, to write down what are the agreements, who's doing it, what resources are going to be used, how are we going to know if it's working or not, and any reference information that makes it useful as we're moving forward. So we write down our agreements, and I had that anyhow. And that kind of brings us, we write down the agreements and we follow through, and that gets us to the end of that cycle. So that's really kind of the heart of the sociocracy process, is the aim, act, reflect cycle of identifying tensions, exploring drivers, developing proposals, making agreements, and then acting on them. There are some other important concepts that are really more kind of in that organizational framework, or how do I want to say it? The behind the scenes stuff, the structures that support the work moving forward. And one is a clear recognition of the difference between governance and operations. And so, governance is how we set our objectives, how we set our goals, how we come up with those high-level agreements. And then operations are, who does what, how do you move things forward? And that becomes really important or useful when we start to identify tensions. Some tensions are operational. What's the best way to get this done? Some tensions are more governance level. Are we on the right path? Are we talking to the right people? Have we included everyone? These are more governance level decisions. And so it often becomes useful to be able to differentiate them, because the way we address them is slightly different. And you know better which tools to use depending on what kind of a challenge you're facing. And one of the key questions then is this covered by a pre-existing agreement? If it is, it's operational. So to use the Lifeboat Academy, we have guilds. Guilds have responsibilities. If we come up with a tension and it fits within the responsibilities of one of the guilds, it's an operational thing. We hand it to the guild, and the guild takes it from there. If it's something that falls through the cracks, that we hadn't thought about this, it doesn't really seem to fit with any of the guilds, then it becomes a higher level governance thing. And that's where you go to, the coordination circle or to the stewardship council. And in terms of how we organize ourselves, speaking of guilds, the concept is we collectively, we're all in this together. All of us who have a stake in this problem, in this project, are responsible for the overall. We are all the ones who are responsible to make it happen, the whole. But that's unwieldy to make decisions at that level for, who's going to update the website. So we delegate authority, we delegate influence. And in the case of the Lifeboat Academy, we say, we know there are these different functions. We're going to carve out who is responsible for those different functions and form circles or subcircles. So there is always delegation from the whole to the parts, which means in some sense, the parts are only ever functioning on behalf of the whole. It's a way of making sure that the parts don't have a meeting, that the parts don't start thinking they're the only thing that exists. So we're always delegating down to more and more local actors who can have influence over the process. But those actors are always looking back up to the whole for ultimate authority. And there are some ways in which also delegation then becomes a developmental tool, so that we're giving more agency. This is also one of the ways that we maximize innovation and creativity, by allowing the people who are really interested in that, focused on that, passionate about that, to take some initiative there within the safety net of it still has to fit within the needs of the whole. And we do that by clarifying domains. So, for example, each of our guilds has a driver statement, and the driver statement is really just this description of why do they exist? What function on behalf of the whole do they take on? What are their key responsibilities, resources that they can use, and how do we know if they're working the way that they're supposed to? So we're delegating authority from the whole into the parts. And there are a number of tools in Sociocracy that help us organize how we actually do the work. This is where agile project management and lean methodology come into it. And I'm not going to go into any of these in particular, but they're just tools in the toolkit to help us do the work as effectively and as efficiently as possible. And I would say the sort of the key here is we are breaking down big, scary goals into bite-sized bits, and we are prioritizing. I'm going to steal one of April's expressions. It's most important to know what we aren't working on, so that we can really focus our effort on what we should be working on. So a lot of these tools are just methods for us being able to say, all of this stuff is on the list, all of this stuff is important, and this stuff we're going to put off for now, and this is the stuff we're going to focus on. So if there are any questions about any of these in particular, we can talk through them. But again, it's just tools in the toolkit for making sure that we're working effectively. And I think we basically have covered all of these. This is really just kind of the summary sheet of ultimately what we're doing is figuring out how do we come together to co-create and continue to that continuous improvement idea. And this is really just that kind of summary statement of, when you put this all together. So ultimately, we're starting with tensions, we're delegating authority, we're responding as things come up, we're making sure that we include people who are affected in the decisions that they make. We're taking care to move carefully through our proposals so that we're avoiding obvious pitfalls, and we're getting smarter as we go. And we're just putting these into a consistent process. And that is basically it. So that is my version of Sociocracy in a nutshell. And I know I've thrown an awful lot at you. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to questions, comments, or observations. I think we can just raise a hand if you've got something that you'd like to ask or add.
Yes, I'm unfortunately super tired, and but I'm hanging on to this as best I can and finding all these points of relevance in these different areas of my life where I'm involved, especially in the co-op, with processes that just are totally incoherent, and having a better understanding of why some things just go sideways again and again because there are no processes. So that helps me to have, despite my tiredness, a real appreciation for what you have presented here. And I can see it's a very deep, and it also helps me understand the processes that we've been involved in here, seeing it within the whole context of the sociocracy map that you've laid out here. So just generally, thank you. That's an awful lot of work, and I really appreciate your presentation of it as clearly as you've done.
Thanks. And I know there is a lot to get your head around. And I would say the good news is it's harder to understand than it is to do.
Yeah.
The actual doing of it is much more straightforward. When you take it stepwise, one step after the other, it just makes sense. And it's just trying to get the picture of the whole that is a little bit challenging. Any other questions, comments, observations? April.
This is one of the best systems that I know for avoiding pitfalls and for working around the common things that happen when people come together, whether it's in corporate settings, nonprofit settings, friendship groups, or whatever it might be. So I think simply in terms of the effectiveness of it, I really, really like it because it doesn't feel like I'm wasting my time at any point. Now, I've worked with lots of the things on the pattern board that we saw, all of those tools and processes. Where I have a problem with this is that I'm not sure of the names of what things are called in this process as compared to the other ones I would identify with. So I get a little confused sometimes on that basis. I'm convinced that this works, and I have been working both informally and formally on this for some years, but there still exists some confusion for me. But then that's probably no surprise to any of you that have been on circles with me.
Well, and I think that actually just talks to the power is that there are these patterns, and the Tao that can be named is not the true Tao. So lots of people are identifying the patterns and just labeling them slightly differently, maybe even putting the emphasis in a slightly different part of it. But and I would say from a sociocratic perspective, what we call it is completely irrelevant. And likewise, the direction for Sociocracy 3.0 is start to apply things where they help, adapt them to your situation, call them whatever you want. You know, you don't need to call. We've, in the Lifeboat Academy, we've renamed a lot of things to have more of a farmy feel, you know, trying to kind of evoke some language that, you know, resonates with regeneration and, you know, those kinds of things. So that only becomes an issue when you're onboarding people, and it's kind of, you know, it doesn't really matter what you call it, but we do this part here when we're thinking about a decision, and we do this part here when we have an agreement, and we do this part here when there's a conflict. And, you know, that's really, I think that, you know, that's just try how to avoid getting hung up on a particular jargon. So yeah, it's a great point. Other comments, questions, observations? Roland.
I was wondering if you'd talk a little bit about adopting sociocracy. I'm thinking about I'm thinking about there has to be a willingness to use it, and there has to be sort of develop an ability to use it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the one of the phrases that keeps coming up for me recently is I am practicing at practicing being a person. So in the sense that sometimes I fall off the wagon. I'm also thinking about uh, um, creating new neural pathways, which means allowing old neural pathways to wither, and the effort that takes.
Mhm.
Yeah. So there's times when I'm currently engaged in a sociocracy process. I'm trying to live it, and there are times when I've fallen off the wagon, so to speak, and have not been practicing the sociocracy, and I feel like I waste time
Mm.
when that happens. So I guess part of it is also just acknowledge. So I'm wondering about that, and I think I'm also acknowledging that I am a person and I make mistakes, and I want to learn from my mistakes. So there, my question.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what the question is there, but because I think that what you're saying is that's just how it is, right? It's I think we're always, and what I like about sociocracy is the continuous improvement aspect. We do the best we can until we know better, and then we do better. And a couple of the things that are and how to introduce it in organizations, I think, is that really is the key. And it's one of the things I like about Sociocracy 3.0 over Sociocracy for All is that there's a little bit more thought in terms of the slow introduction of sociocracy into a system. Um, there are a couple places where I think it's really easy to introduce it. One is navigating via tensions and appreciative inquiry lens. So the tension is, no matter, like, someone fell off the wagon, there's going to be a tension around that, and so the solution presents itself automatically. Oh, there's a tension here. Well, let's explore that tension. What's going on under the surface? Well, one of the things is it's a new system and we're still trying to get used to it, and sometimes I forget. Oh, what do we do about that? Well, maybe there's some places we can put in some reminders, or maybe we can simplify things, or maybe we can let go of, maybe we're trying to do too many things at once and we can let go of some things and focus on others. So the navigating via tensions, the beauty of tensions is you don't have to create a tension. They're just going to show up. And to have the navigating via tensions tool in your pocket, it's like, oh boy, look, we get to use that navigation thing. And so you don't really even have to worry about if you get it wrong. If you get it wrong and a tension pops up, pull out the navigating via tensions. And I would say, in terms of the proactive part of it, the coming back to the 7 principles, coming back to and the agreements. How do we want to work with each other? How do we want to be working with each other? What are our agreements? Well, let's just take a moment to revisit the agreements that we've already made. Do they still work? They're always open-ended. It's not, you're never going to bludgeon somebody over the head with the agreements. Does that still work? Do these agreements still work? We're open to how do we refine them? So I would, and likewise, it can become, like I said, I usually do a peak experience with new groups that I'm working with. How has it worked best for you? What's your best experience of working well with other people? And then how do we consolidate that into some reminders of how we want to work with each other? And then no one's imposing this on anyone. You just say, well, we talked about, this is how we work best together. Does that still make sense? Do we need to refine it? So it's a very non-conflictual way of bringing people onto a way of working. And then the navigating via tensions is a way of saying, and we're going to try it, we're going to see how it goes, and we're going to see if we can get better. So AMAC, reflect, bring in the agreements, and navigate via tensions. So that's the simple introduction. Does that work?
That was a great answer to my non-question.
And Roland, your non-question segued into what my question was going to be, which Ben just answered. So it's all good. It's all emergent and connected.
Any other questions, comments, non-questions?
Well, so I'm kind of curious, are you using this on the farm? I mean, do you do this every day? You sit in
Yeah.
circle every day?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
Yeah.
wow, that's quite amazing. I think, well, I've worked, I think, with Ted Rowe.
Wow.
Is that Sociocracy 3.0
No,
or
he's
the other
Sociocracy for All.
for all?
Yeah.
What would be the main difference then, if you could go over that one more time, since that's the one I think I know something about?
They are subtle differences. I think the differences that I appreciate in Sociocracy 3.0 is that it has agile and lean methodology built into it. So it has a different way of doing how the actual work delegation part that's a little bit better integrated. And I haven't seen anything in Sociocracy for All that I don't like. It's
Mhm.
just I like the other thing is that the Sociocracy for All materials are their materials, and Sociocracy 3.0 is Creative Commons. So I can't use Sociocracy for All materials without kind of getting permission, but I can use the Sociocracy 3.0.
Wasn't it Buck? Somebody Buck who kind of put the newer version together. John Buck, wasn't that his name? Where does he
No,
fit into this?
I don't know that name. It's Bernhard Bockelbrink, James
Yeah.
Priest, and her name's on the front file. Lelia, I can't remember her last name. And I think she's in Spain.
I think Buck was the guy from the Netherlands or from somewhere in Europe who my understanding was he was the guy who sort of first put it together in a modern way. It doesn't matter. The only other
yeah. And there are lots, and that's the other thing. I don't want to. I should say there are lots and lots of influences on this,
Yeah.
and there are lots of very similar ideas. And I think that's all of these people are trying to say, here are patterns of when we work well together, and I'm going to call it this, and I'm going to call it that. And so that's what April was saying, is there's so many of these that are really, really similar, and it's hard actually sometimes to figure out what the differences are. And for me, I'm like, credit all around. And
Yeah.
ultimately, you need to adapt it to what works for you and develop your own language. So,
Yeah, it's funny because I've been teaching dialogue since the early 90s, and I use the same question, what have you found works when meetings work? What are the qualities of conversation that work? And generally, I don't call them the things that you said, but generally there are some of those things.
yeah.
And then we build guidelines for conversation that we use in dialogue. The only thing that I would say is that I find using Sociocracy all the time to be very slow, especially at the brainstorming stage. I don't even know how to do Sociocracy if you're trying to really be generative. So, I mean, I'm certainly willing to try it and learn, but I also find just one thing, because I do come from quite a different orientation. I find questioning assumptions to be a lot easier if it's more free form. Like I could just directly ask you, oh, I don't quite understand the assumption you're making, rather than waiting for it to go all the way around the circle, if you understand. So I don't know. I would go for some kind of blended model personally, but that's coming from an OD person. And
yeah, and I would say Sociocracy the Sociocracy 3.0 doesn't say do it like this. And they would say anytime there's a tool that you think would be more effective, use that tool at any point. In fact, there's a slide that they have that is artful participation. And I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it's basically, what is my best contribution now And is that to actually violate the system?
Mm-hmm.
So they actually invite and I would say that sociocracy is really about, or ultimately, it is about creating an organizational structure. So it's an alternative to a pyramid diagram.
Yeah.
It is not meant to be this is the only way to work and you have to do it this way. Including we are, I think I am, and I think we are enamored with the circle process, which is not sociocracy. Circle process is actually something that we have sort of blended more heavily into our form of sociocracy than other places. And I've worked with organizations where the sociocracy side of it is not circle process. Like you don't have to do a consent in a circle. You can do a popcorn consent process. You can actually do online voting consent process. So there's what's that online tool? Ronnie, you might, because they use it for Vivero. Oh shoot, it's out of New Zealand, I think.
Lumio.
Lumio.
Oh,
Yeah.
Lumia.
Yeah. So like you can use Lumio as a way of doing these steps. You know, you don't have to do them in a circle. We lean into the circle a lot because I think because what we're doing is really trying to bring people from really different perspectives and who don't necessarily have a deep history of collaboration into it. And the circle process, I find, diffuses a lot of the power dynamics that people come in with.
Sure. Yeah.
So a lot of what you're experiencing with the Lifeboat Academy is already a hybrid. It's not pure sociocracy. It's our form of sociocracy. And even in the pure form of sociocracy, they would say, if it works, use it. You know, and if this works better, if something doesn't work for you, I would say, that's also the indigenous way I've always learned is take the tools that work for you, leave the rest behind. If it doesn't work for you, leave it. Don't use it.
Can you define circle process? What you mean by that for me?
And sorry, can I jump in just for a second? I don't want to, because I see Pamela's got her hand up, but I think that this might be useful. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but sociocracy uses the word circle, but it doesn't mean the same thing as circle process. Is that right?
Yeah, and the original form was the sociocratic circle process, but there is also peace circle process and circle process. This is what I'm saying. Lots of people are trying to identify patterns and tools and using similar language. So, and I can't remember, Linda, I can't remember exactly that, but what I would define as the circle process is you start with a grounding. So you're bringing people into a semi-sacred space out of ordinary space. You're starting with agreements of how we want to have this space, how we, like you're saying with the guidelines, how do we want to use this space together? You do go person to person, although that also can be suspended when it's useful. And very much like dialogue in the circle is not meant to be a decision-making, it's not intended as a decision-making tool. It's intended as a meaning-creating, meaning-sharing space. So then that's actually why a lot of people say circle process and sociocracy are a good marriage, because the circle gives you the grounded understanding, the shared sense, and then the sociocracy gives you a way of implementing it. So, the sociocracy is more about how does stuff get done.
Yeah.
And the circle process is more about how do we develop an understanding of where we're all coming from. But it's all lingo. It's all, it's all, what does ours need to look like for it to feel effective for us?
Right.
And likewise, it's a living system. So in my mind, sociocracy is a living system. So when somebody comes in, it is everyone's right and responsibility to say, once you understand the system, oh, I see what's the intention. I see how this works here. I'm going to propose that this would be even better if, and you put forward an amendment, and then that becomes our new form of sociocracy. So it's meant to be a dynamic, living, adaptable system.
Okay for now. Thanks.
Cool. And over to you, Pamela.
Yeah, I think you answered my question more or less in that. Partly I was wondering how much needed to be really grasped clearly in order to start implementing any single part of it. And so my understanding from what you're saying is that you can have multiple entry points through the tools themselves, which is good to know. And also, I really appreciate the clarification about the circle process being specifically effective with the meaning making or creating a shared understanding or creating an understanding of what's in the room, as opposed to it being a tool for implementing a decision making. Because I've already been talking with another co-op member about incorporating that in a process in a committee that I'm part of where it's very chaotic. And so this is going to be helpful for me to experiment with in that case. Yeah.
April?
I think, yeah, that lots of different techniques can be used as long as the principles are adhered to, and as long as we continue to come back to the principles when things get chaotic or confusing, or we feel like we've lost our way. Because they really do ground good human relations practice, I believe. And they do manage lots of stuff that is inherent to working together with other humans, which is all the things that we know that it is. And we're all choosing to do that really clearly and intentionally. So that's a good thing. I was also just reflecting that I've worked with sociocratic things for quite a while because I've done a lot of work across cultures, for one thing, and there's all sorts of things there that make it easier to communicate and to be on the same page, I suppose, simply across cultural understandings, which we can't have a multitude of all at once, because that just does get really chaotic. But this is a way of sorting that. And the other thing is I've worked a lot in the UK and with European colleagues for years and years, and they've continued to bring in elements of this, particularly, and also the lean and agile stuff. So it feels quite comfortable at this point. It's a comfortable kind of discomfort to be able to work in the system at this point. But I've had lots of people helping me figure that out and tell me that I'm doing okay, even though I'm sort of think I'm floundering, which is my experience of cross-cultural work. Is there's a good deal of floundering. You need people who are of a particular culture to help be your ally and your path finder or path keeper with you, I guess.
Yeah, and that's the leaning into treat everything as if you take one thing away from this, it is treat everything as an experiment to get better at what you're doing. So what's something that we could try, whatever it is you're working on, what would that look like if we tried it for a month at our next meeting? What would it look like if we tried that for this one little part of it? And then we'll debrief. And maybe it's a horrible failure. Maybe it's just a train wreck. Okay, how risky is it to, risk one meeting or 1 month of work? And then when you debrief, did anything work? Are there any bits of this we want to keep? Any bits of this that are kind of worth tweaking and improving? And what bits do we just want to leave behind? And I think that's the framework that makes all of this, all the other stuff make sense, right? It's like, you don't have to have it all figured out. What's the next experiment we want to run? That's all we need to do. What's the next step? Bonnie, over to you.
I wanted to speak to the circle as a tool for meaning making and generation instead of decision making, and how ironically sometimes decisions naturally come out of circle process just because people are sharing what's important to them and sharing what's what's actually going on. Like we've had many there've been times when we've had conversations and like should we do circle about this in the Lifeboat Academy? I mean, like, should we do circle? And we're like, yeah, let's do circle. And we go into circle even just to just talk something out. And then naturally someone's like, sounds like we've made a decision here, which is often probably, I think, a better and different decision than we might have made if we hadn't actually used that kind of processing tool. So I think it's useful to move to not always sit down trying to make a decision now, but rather what is the context in which we're thinking about making a decision? Like what is actually, if we all get on the same page, I think often the decision reveals itself, which is, I just find it to be really cool and also takes the pressure off of all of it, really.
Yeah. And I think, and that's the thing about this, by saying it's not about making a decision, it makes it so much easier to make the decision, because the decision, when it's framed as a decision, it's so easy for it to fall into for or against, you know, and you think that there's one proposal when, you know, there could be proposal A prime, B, Z, you know, like, yeah, so it takes a lot of the pressure off of it.
And I'm going to add a little bit to that. It's not only for or against, but often in the old neural pathways, it is who is going to make the decision. It's not going to be me, you know, or who is in charge, who's the one who's able to, has the authority to make the decision. And when you go into circle process, it sort of helps to, you're taken out of that sort of state of mind. I was going to qualify what kind of state of mind it is, but I won't do that. So that's one of the ways in which I find it useful. Yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, any other thoughts, questions, Linda?
Well, I mean, it's funny how we think of things. I have always thought of sociocracy as complementing what my work was with dialogue, in that it helps lead to decisions. So it's interesting to hear, Ronnie, you say, you know, the circle process, it just naturally leads to decisions because it's about meaning making. Well, dialogue does the same thing. So I always tell organizations I've worked with, you know, if you do dialogue first, then you move towards a decision making model, it's so much easier and so much clearer about what the decision should be. So in a sense, I'm still seeing the same approach. I'm just going to be a gunner for maybe opening it up a little bit more at the brainstorming end, so that it's not, you know, that's all. But it's a wonderful combination, really, of meaning making and decision making in one model. So it's nice that way.
Well, and again, I come back to the experimental part too, because even if this is, I think this is kind of a real tangent, but the problem with religion is that it gets calcified, because you come up with a system that works really well, and then you're slavish. You have to do it, you know, this many Hail Marys, and then this, you know, then up, then down, then this song, and I think that no matter how good a system there is, no matter what the merit is, if you only use that system, if you keep using that system, it ossifies, you know, it gets too stiff. And so, you know, kind of being able to shake it up is always good. It gets the creative juices going. And I see we've got a hard stop, and we're getting close to time anyhow. And I think this is a great opportunity to say, like, does anyone have any last thoughts for the good of the cause that you're just dying to share before we wrap up? Having squelched all conversation. Actually, I think this was really grateful that you were all here. The questions and the conversation was really rich, and this is, of course, this is the first time that I have trotted out this presentation from the Sociocracy toolkit. And so thanks for letting me demo it on you, run you as an experiment. And we'll put the recording up on YouTube, and then there will be other opportunities for the Sociocracy training out there. So thank you for being here, and well, we'll see you all soon.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Thanks,
Well,
Ben. Bye.
Thank you.
great history. It's great.
Yeah.